For decades, Africa's oil fueled Europe, America, and China. But something has changed quietly. A new power is stepping in, and it's India. As global tensions rise and old alliances weaken, Africa is rewriting its energy partnerships, choosing stability over tradition and strategy over pressure. What happens when the world's fastest growing energy giant takes the lead in Africa's oil future? This shift could change global power forever.
Africa's oil trade is entering a new era, quietly, steadily, and with consequences that few fully understand. The old alliances that once defined global energy flows are loosening, and new pathways are being carved across oceans and political boundaries. For decades, Africa's oil moved predictably toward familiar destinations. Tankers sailed toward Western ports, long-standing contracts guaranteed supply, and the global energy map seemed fixed. But under the surface, a transformation has been unfolding. Traditional partners are slowly losing ground, and one rising power has been stepping forward with patience, strategy, and hunger: India. For much of modern history, Africa's oil flowed primarily toward Europe, the United States, and later, China. These relationships were built during colonial and early post-independence periods, when infrastructure, trade routes, and legal frameworks were designed to support Western industrial growth. African oil fields were developed to feed refineries thousands of miles away. Crude oil left African shores in massive volumes, and refined fuel returned at higher prices, locking the continent into a cycle of dependency. These patterns shaped global energy markets for decades. Shipping lanes, insurance systems, currency settlements, and pricing benchmarks were all aligned with these traditional relationships. Over time, China entered the picture with aggressive investment strategies. It built pipelines, ports, storage facilities, and offered large infrastructure projects in exchange for guaranteed oil supplies. For a while, this triad of Europe, the United States, and China appeared unshakable. But history rarely stands still. Shifts in politics, wars, economic instability, and changing national priorities began to erode the foundations of this old system. At the same time, India's energy appetite was growing at a pace few had predicted. Population growth accelerated across sprawling cities and rural regions. Industries expanded, absorbing millions of new workers. Highways stretched across the country, ports modernized, airports multiplied, and manufacturing zones rose from once empty land. Every new road meant more vehicles. Every factory required more power. Every growing city demanded more electricity and fuel. Unlike older industrial powers that had already built their energy foundations, India was still constructing its economic future in real time. This growing hunger for energy forced India to look outward. Domestic oil production could not meet internal demand. Imports became a matter of survival rather than convenience. But instead of simply copying older Western models of trade, India began crafting a more flexible, relationship-driven approach. It was less about domination and more about partnership, less about short-term advantage and more about long-term security. This approach resonated strongly with African producers who had grown wary of historical patterns of dependency. Global events accelerated this transformation. Geopolitical tensions fractured old alliances. Economic sanctions disrupted long-standing trade routes. Conflicts in key regions forced energy markets to search for new stability. Traditional buyers became less predictable, sometimes restricted by political decisions, sometimes distracted by internal crises. At the same time, African nations began to rethink their own positions in the global system. Rather than placing all their resource wealth in the hands of a few long-standing partners, they started seeking diversified and reliable buyers. This was the opening that India quietly stepped into. Major African oil producers began strengthening ties with Indian refiners and energy companies. Export agreements expanded, not just in volume, but in structure. Instead of one-sided extraction contracts, new deals emphasized shared value. Refineries received technical cooperation. Storage facilities were improved. Shipping agreements became more flexible. Payment systems adapted to reduce dependence on traditional currencies and financial institutions that had historically disadvantaged African states. What made India particularly attractive was not just its growing demand, but the way it approached partnership. Long-term contracts created stability. Flexible payment systems reduced financial pressure during global price swings. Cooperation between refineries helped African countries improve local processing capacities. Technology sharing agreements allowed African engineers and technicians to learn advanced refining and transportation methods. Infrastructure support extended beyond oil fields, impacting roads, ports, and storage facilities that benefited wider economies. As these ties strengthened, the global oil market began to feel new pressures. Western energy security became more fragile as guaranteed supplies from Africa became less certain. China, once confident in its dominant position, found itself facing unexpected competition from India's quieter, more relationship-oriented strategy. Pricing power began to shift subtly. African producers had more buyers, more negotiating power, and more confidence. Instead of accepting dictated prices, they could leverage competition to their advantage. The winners in this new alignment were clear in subtle but powerful ways. African oil-producing nations gained stronger bargaining positions, improved infrastructure, and greater autonomy in trade decisions. Indian refiners secured stable long-term supplies necessary for sustained growth. New shipping and logistics companies emerged, benefiting from increased traffic and diversified routes. The losers, though less openly discussed, were equally real. Traditional Western companies found contracts becoming harder to renew. Influence that had once been automatic began to erode. China faced a more competitive environment where investment alone no longer guaranteed loyalty. Global energy institutions, long shaped by Western frameworks, found themselves adjusting to new realities where power was no longer centralized in familiar hands. Looking forward, the implications of this shift stretch far beyond oil itself. Africa's bargaining power is growing, not just in energy, but in all strategic resources. India's position in the global system is evolving from a developing economy to a central architect of future trade networks. The world is witnessing the emergence of a new energy axis, one built not on dominance, but on mutual necessity and evolving trust. If the current trajectory continues, Africa may no longer be seen as merely a supplier of raw energy, but as a strategic partner capable of shaping global markets. India may move from being a hungry buyer to a key stabilizer in global energy systems. Older powers will not disappear, but their roles will continue to change, becoming more reactive than directive. And at the heart of it all lies a quiet truth. This shift is not being announced with headlines or dramatic speeches. It is happening through contracts signed away from cameras, tankers rerouted at sea, and conversations held in boardrooms far from public view. This makes it even more powerful, because when the world finally notices, the balance may have already changed. In the end, this story is not just about oil. It is about power, independence, strategy, and the slow rewriting of global systems that once seemed permanent. Africa's oil partners are shifting, not because of conflict, but because of choice. India's rise in this space is not loud or aggressive, but steady and deliberate. And when history looks back at this moment, it may not see a sudden explosion of change, but a quiet realignment, one that permanently reshaped global power.